My name's Graham Nichols.
And I'm Mark Fentham.
And you're
listening
Ordinary to Ordinary. We are so unrehearsed because we haven't got Josh or Isaac here. We don't quite know what to do and who's supposed to be kind of grounding it all. So we're going to end up sort of talking over each other, competing for airspace, all that sort of thing. But neither Isaac or Josh are able to make it today. So hello to you, Isaac and Josh, wherever you are. And it's just left to us to do the episode today. So what are we going to think about today, Mark?
Well, it feels a bit like we've been bandits, doesn't it? Just feels like we're kind of going off air, doing what we want, just kind of going for a little bit of a spin. Just thought, hey, let's take this bad boy for a spin ourselves without kind of, the adults there in charge.
It does feel that, but it also feels a little bit scary, like we might do something wrong, like we might let the handbrake off at the wrong time or something. And, everything sort of careers out into the motorway dangerously.
But it's going to go one or two ways, isn't it? It's either going to be the shortest podcast ever, because we'll run out of steam without Josh asking us or Isaac asking us questions, or it's going to be the longest ever podcast ever because there's no one to stop us and we're just going to keep going and running and having too much fun. But we thought, with just the two of us, we thought that it would be good, particularly this week with COP26 happening, to talk about climate and Christianity, particularly in response to something that's been a bit of a stir in the social media world, which is a banner that a church in Glasgow put up, the Tron Church, a great church, a Bible-believing, Bible-teaching church with good guys who lead it. And the banister they put up was, "The world's most urgent need is churches preaching Christ crucified, not climate change." And this caused a massive stir, not just in the non-Christian world, but actually really in the Christian world, with lots of people, actually some obviously supporting it, and many really upset by it. What do you reckon?
Well, yeah, I was waiting for Josh to say something, and he didn't.
Oh, no.
I suppose, just to get the negatives out of the way first, there can always be a question about the tactics of a notice like this, and thinking about how it's perceived. So I think we'll probably spend a bit of time talking about the kind of principles of what's being talked about and talk about climate change and all that sort of thing. So you could have a lots of discussion about that, which hopefully we will. But you could still think, well, I don't know whether the tactics, and I suppose there's a little bit of me that thinks, I wonder if the tactic of this is quite right. Obviously, I respect churches and they can decide to do whatever they want outside the front of their buildings. And it obviously provoked lots of discussion, so maybe that was a good thing. So although I don't disagree with, in a sense, a single word, obviously preaching Christ crucified is really important, but it's that sort of, it's that kind of how is it read thing, as to whether it's just heard as, oh, Christians don't think climate change is important at all, or they're climate deniers, or something like that. So I suppose that's my little negative to get out of the way. I don't know if you have anything similar, Mark.
Well, and I think that is, I think a lot of that is where it is as if Christians, it means that Christians don't care about climate at all. And I think that's been the big issue. But what's interesting that's coming out is that people seem to be putting it as equal. So
yes.
The response has not just been, actually that feels a little bit clunky, or that's the wisdom of, well, is that a little bit too provocative? Actually, what people are offended about is that it's as if creation and climate control should be of equal with preaching Christ crucified. That you can't not preach Christ crucified without kind of preaching a sense of, actually climate change and all of that is of equal importance, as it were. And that's what it seems that people are more upset about, not the fact that actually they're saying, well, maybe, there could have been a bit more thought in terms of, tactics, etc.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting was the Archbishop of Canterbury got sort of misquoted. No, he actually didn't get misquoted, but maybe he got misemphasized, because he said, or he made a comparison between not doing anything about climate change and the deaths it might cause, and the Nazis. I don't know if you saw that.
No.
So Laura Kunsberger of the BBC kind of turned it into a sort of tweet that basically said Archbishop of Canterbury compares climate change or recklessness with climate change with the Nazis, and then he had to immediately apologise because particularly apologise to Jews, of course, because sort of making that parallel was, in a sense, an exaggeration. But I think what although there may be some merit in saying it's significant, being reckless and possibly causing deaths is a significant thing to talk about. The fact that the Archbishop kind of leads on that, whether he was quoted precisely or not, the fact that he leads on that as his main thing, and he's not saying, for example, even people responsible for abortion are similar to the Nazis, which would be a much more direct parallel, I would say. He says people who are kind of presiding over climate change, like the Nazis, just suggests a mindset in, let's say, the Church of England and kind of much of the church that would make that parallel. And I think that's why lots of Christians have objected to this, and maybe some do think that our responsibility as stewards is kind of equal to our responsibility to preach the gospel. And I think that's the kind of heart of it, really.
I agree. So, what should our response be? I guess I was part of the which strikes me as well is that part of the problem. Let's talk of some of that you want to be very supportive of talking about this issue as important. But there seems to me that part of the issue is that there is such a weight being attached to COP26, as if that these guys who are leaders can fix every problem the world has got with kind of external changes, taxation, laws, however. But the problem they've got, and I think this is where the banner begins, the problem they've got is that they can't deal with the human heart and sin and the wrestle, and by that I don't mean even fixing the reality of the biggest problem we would say is our issue, which is forgiveness of sin before the Lord, but the fact that we are sinful beings with selfish desires, which means that actually whatever plans you put, unless you convince every single person on this planet that this is the most important thing you've got to do, that and everyone does it, the reality is people won't, because of sin, selfish circumstances, all sorts of reasons. So you kind of wonder, can they even deal with the issue they're trying to deal with? Can they actually even bring about what they want to bring about?
Well, yeah, I think that's why it's
There's
kind
a
of
stream of thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of multi-layered, isn't it? Because a bit like COVID, that you could sort of start with the principles, but then some of the practice gets a bit more complicated. So I think it's probably just worth saying for anyone listening that we would both totally agree that we have been made responsible as stewards of the earth, as God's rulers on this earth, to rule and subdue. But that also means take care of the planet. We are supposed to be consumers. We are supposed to cut down trees and to build boats and to rule the world. So there is always going to be some degree of environmental damage. As soon as anyone cut down the first tree or harvested the first fruit, you could say there's environmental damage happening on the earth. So we're there to be stewards, but we also are there to consume to some degree the world in the process of subduing it. And it's getting that balance between being a kind of reckless consumer that just says we're not just going to cut down trees and build boats and feed ourselves and learn and explore, but we're actually going to damage to the point that we kind of create extinct trees and wildlife and habitat and spoil God's creation. So it's finding that kind of balance between using, whether it's fossil fuel or anything else, using energy and using products of the earth and exploiting them. And then there's other kind of layers to it to do with, in the process of consuming, do we damage others? Damage the environment of traditional farmers or hunters, or pollute their rivers. So downstream somewhere all the fish die, and people who've traditionally fished, all those sort of things, all those multi-layered things. So I think most thinking Christians, and we are thinking Christians, would say, yep, we're there to steward, and that would be at the sort of level of don't pollute, but it would also be at the level of, if demonstrably something big we're doing, some major policy like, flying aeroplanes, using petrol, if something is demonstrably doing much more damage than it is just consuming, then we would want policies that are more restrained. And if there is a sort of connection between our consumption and climate change, then we would want to say, well, that's kind of over-consuming. We need to at least think about whether we can do anything about that. So I think that's, you would agree with that, wouldn't you, Mark? That sort of
absolutely, and I think and we've done a series on that in the life of the church, haven't we, in terms of thinking about how we are stewards of God's creation, and that is a good thing and a right thing.
Yeah.
And so, although we may have some reservations about actually how effective COP26 can be because of human heart and issues, we kind of recognise that actually what they're trying to achieve is a good thing.
Absolutely.
We might not agree with all the ways they do it, but the principle, the desire has got to be right, hasn't it? That we are responsible and take care of that which God has created and made and says is good. I think so there is that. Yeah,
I think where it gets complicated is the next layer, which is, okay, so let's we agree all that. What does it exactly look like to be a good steward? How much consumption is okay? Should I still be eating bananas? Should I still be driving a petrol car or a diesel car? Is an electric car actually better? Should I be lobbying my government to build loads of wind farms or solar farms, solar generation farms? Should I be phasing out fossil fuel? And I think those things become much more complicated. And I said it's a bit like COVID in the sense that you're suddenly walking into an area of specialist knowledge, and although there are kind of scientific reports and everything else, they're very complicated. Just as a trivial example, and I'm not saying this is right, but I was reading something yesterday that was saying basically the report that everyone's kind of briefing on to do with COP26 is the most worst reasonable case that they're looking at. Now that's fine, but and there may be all sorts of good reasons why they're doing that. But of all the models to pick the kind of worst case, is that a sensible thing? I don't really know as a layman, but I do know that it's really complicated, and no one really understands all the feedback loops and quite how whatever the word accurate the model is. So I think it just gets complicated because Christians could disagree. You and I could disagree. You could say, I really want to, we should have wind farms and we should stop burning coal. And I could say, well, I've read this article, and it said burning coal wasn't that bad, and actually the amount of environmental damage to build enough wind farms to generate electricity would be much more environmentally damaging. And so then we're in a respectful discussion, but there's not a right and wrong.
Well, and it's interesting that we've been talking about a lot recently, isn't it? Just in terms of even how we read the data on COVID, it is, that there is something where a mature believer at the end of the day has to recognise as well that actually we can both read the same data and come to different conclusions, and actually there's not a right or a wrong. It's just an informed understanding as we seek to make sense of it. So you've got the complexity of just understanding what's going on, but I think the added complexity is priority. Time. You listed out a load of things there about where, have I got time to work out my view on wind farms and coal ideas and whether buying this banana over that banana, there's only in priority of my day, there is only so much actually time I can give to kind of what would it actually look like to be, so environment good steward in every aspect. You could spend hours, and people do, don't they? They give up their whole lives to just working this issue. But that's not where we're all called. It's not where we're all at. And how do I prioritise my time? And in that sense, you start to get to see where that banner is heading. Okay, so now we're talking not that we think one is not important, but actually where's the priority beginning to fall, and how do I juggle that? How do I make sense of the fact, well, actually, okay, we're finite beings. I only have so much time in a day, so many hours in a week. I'm called to work. I'm called to parent. I'm called to be engaged in lots of other areas, including preaching the gospel, which seems to have an even greater eternity kind of issue for people. Less biblically, I can think, well, creation, I know that Jesus will take care of creation. He will sort the physical world out, as it were, but he calls us to proclaim the gospel so that men and women turn to him and repent and are drawn to him in that sense. So therefore, there is a priority of preaching Christ crucified, which becomes does that not become then the biggest issue?
I think so, yeah. I was just reading some comments on someone today on the topic, and they were about to preach Romans 8, I think, about the creation groaning. And I think biblically, although there's all the points about stewards, there is a degree to which we never subdue since the fall. There's always thorns and thistles, and that idea of creation groaning kind of suggests there will always be a fragmentation and a sort of an imperfection about creation. And maybe climate change is one manifestation of it, but it happens in lots of other ways. About everything's kind of beautiful, but it doesn't quite work right. And so the thinking we can achieve salvation through climate improvement, or that we can save the planet ourselves, kind of is theologically rather inept, and so it's a matter of priority, as you were saying, but it's also a matter of, it's a kind of a misreading of Scripture to even think that we could save the planet, because in one way or other there will always be a fragmentation and a brokenness about creation.
Well, now I think we're getting to kind of more of the nub of where this is breaking out, why there was such an uproar, isn't it? Because there is a sense whereby the creation has become the functional God.
Yeah.
So if you remove, a God and you kind of say, okay, well, we've got a responsibility, but actually it becomes so big in one's life that actually we see that as more important or as equal of importance. I think that's where biblically, I think you begin to get unstuck. I just don't see Scripture saying that, absolutely I'm called to proclaim justice, do what I can in justice, but fundamentally the priority has to be people who need. Now, now I know it's messy and complex, and it gets harder as you push that out, because you don't want to sound like we don't care about people's actual, situations of, needs now or all of those kind of things. But we are saying there is a priority to the spiritual that will last forever, rather than the now. So how do you work that balance? And I think it goes to the social justice question, but it comes out here in the creation, which becomes the priority. And sometimes it feels like creation becomes the God that we're trying to serve, worship, save, rather than actually serving the living God who does.
Yeah, and I think it would be an interesting thought exercise, which I've only just thought of, so it might be a stupid idea, but I'll just try it out, which is, just suppose everyone on the whole planet was saved, so they're all Christians. It's an interesting thought exercise to say, so could we then save the planet? Well, no, there'd be more generations of people that need saving, and the world would still be broken. And so it's a futile exercise in trying to save the planet, or to think we can achieve salvation through the planet. So I definitely don't anyone hear this as we want to check out and say, well, it's all too difficult, and so we don't have a view. We can have lots of views, like we might have views on the refugee crisis, or we might have views on the best economic solution, or we might vote for a government that we think is more responsible environmentally or not, depending on what our views are. So that's not we don't check out of all those things, because we're responsible citizens, and we may even have a job in an environmental industry and have to think about that, and we might make personal choices about recycling and everything else. But we'll make that a priority if we think that's how we achieve salvation, and we'll give that a lot of mind time. If we put it in its kind of rightful place, recognise to some degree the futility of it, but the importance of it, we'll realise that the gospel is more important, and that this groaning of creation is actually a symptom of the fact that we're all broken, and we need salvation, and we need a ticket to the new creation, which doesn't have any of those flaws. So it's a bit crass to say it, really, but the new creation won't suffer from climate change and exhaust fumes and smog, and polluted rivers and all those sort of things. And we want to get people there more important than we want to stop changing the climate, if indeed we are changing the climate. So I think, I think
that's where we end up, though, isn't it? Is that we're saying actually there is a better answer to then actually what COP26 is proposing, because the better answer is, in the end of the day, is people coming to know Christ and ultimately looking forward and trusting to the hope that Christ promises, which is a restored, renewed creation, that actually he will mend his broken creation, he will restore it. That's the hope of Romans 8. That is then fulfilled in, you see the pictures in Revelation 21, that he will do that work. So actually we have a better hope of a creation that is fulfilled and restored and renewed, one that will be eternal, that won't be groaning or broken or polluted, as you say. But more than that, not only do we have a better hope that we want to share, but we also believe that actually that's, that as I then seek to serve the living God and worship him in a right response, that is going to then cause me to want to love my neighbours, and I'm going to love my neighbours better because I'm going to be concerned about how I steward the world and creation and care for others and concern for people. But there's a right priority. It's flowing from a heart that is serving Christ, loving Christ, and doing what he's called me to do in the spheres that he has put me in, without making suddenly my whole world about actually I've got to save the creation and the climate. Actually, what I've got to do is worship the living God, and as I do that, I'm going to start doing some of those other things as I have priority and time to do so.
Yeah, and I think the general public, people who are observing Christians and observing messages and banners and everything else, they may sometimes misunderstand that. We may not always get it right, but I think it's worth trying to get it right. As the Tron have and other articles that I've read, trying to say, look, this is important, but it's not that important. And, and lots of people recognizing as well which I think you sort of started to say, but just to fill it out a little bit more, that there is a religion of climate change. And the problem is that it's in a way much easier than living the Christian life. If you get into the climate sort of situation, the kind of sin is pollution or CO2 or something, and the coming judgment is the earth overheating, and the way of redemption is to do less or fly less or something, and it immediately becomes a very simple religion of works, where to some degree we're either campaigning or we're doing something, and that feels like we're sort of achieving salvation. So I think there's a particularity about the climate thing that's not quite there with other things. So there are other things that are important, like you mentioned, social justice, or care of refugees, or care of the poor in society, or care of the older. So there's lots of other issues, but I don't think they have quite the same sort of narrative power or sort of religious power as climate change, because climate is such a massive thing. It very easily, for Christians, especially for those who are not, it very easily becomes a very strong sort of religious pull, because of those fundamental elements of judgment and salvation that are kind of built into it.
Absolutely. You only hear the Prime Minister, don't you? We're at 1 minute to midnight, as if suddenly midnight is the end of the world and doom and gloom and everything else is coming. Yeah. Now, theologically, we disagree with that, because theologically we know that actually the end of the world will only come when Christ returns. It's not going to come about because the climate suddenly explodes. Although that may be, I guess, the way in which Jesus brings it about. But I don't think that's what you see in Scripture. No. I think you see him coming. So we know that's not true. But as you say, it has this sense of, if we don't do anything, we're all going to die and destroyed and doom. And that kind of impact, which actually means that the only way we can save that and have a better world is by, stopping and helping the climate. Whereas actually we're saying, no, there's a fundamentally bigger problem with this world, which is not that climate. It's like you're trying to deal with a cut on the, with a gaping wound in your hand with just a little sticky plaster, which actually needs your stitches and antibiotics inside, and because you're not dealing with the real issue, which is the heart of the human beings that actually are the ones who are causing the mess by their own sinfulness. But until you address that issue and their own response to the Lord, you're never going to get a truly reformed position where people are wanting to actually steward well in a right way, in a biblical way, because there's always going to be, you see it in the hypocrisy, that they're all flying in. You see, all the kind of those who climate people who got there, they've all gone on trains, and because they're not. That's how the world works as well.
Yeah, and I think,
help me out here, Grant.
No, I think there's some people who. I mean, I'm not so worried about them flying in on aeroplanes and everything else, because that's kind of.
I'm not either.
That's the kind of way they've got to get there. But I think it kind of illustrates that this is a complicated issue, and I don't think anyone is saying we should revert to some kind of primitive agrarian lifestyle. And I've read books that would suggest that even if we did do that, the amount of with the population there is on the earth now, the amount of CO2 from us all kind of burning our own little fires, and the lack of efficient food production would actually be much worse. So I think people are actually a little bit lost as to where we're going with it anyway. But I still think, just coming back to the very beginning, that we've still got a job to do in prioritizing salvation, but not dismissing the climate issues, and finding ways of talking about it that are a little bit more drilled down than just saying, yeah, we need to look after the planet, but then not kind of taking it any further. So I think it's worth talking about those things, as it is worth talking about other social justice issues and poverty issues and so forth, and framing them in terms of saved people who are on their way to the new heavens and new earth, who are not trying to save the planet, but they're trying to be sanctified people made in the image of Christ, who are reflecting the love of Christ, and in some ways anticipating the new heavens and new earth, but recognizing that we'll never get there. And that kind of nuancing of this only really can flow out of someone who knows kind of where they're going and has hope. That messaging, I think, is important to get across, and particularly amongst younger people, there's just a danger of being heard as being either climate change deniers, which may have some merit to it, but being heard as just as that, or sort of don't carers, or well, you're on the way to heaven, so don't care about the planet, sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's quite challenging in how we talk about it. But challenging doesn't mean you kind of give up and don't talk about it at all, or worse still, do what some Christians have done, which we again talked about at the beginning, which was fall over entirely into this is the most important issue that we've faced forever, in our history, which I don't think is true. I think there've been bigger moral issues and bigger climate issues probably. Incidentally, I don't think as you say, until the world ends, I don't think, until the world ends is not going to end. And I don't think you should be irresponsible to say, well, there's the Noah promise. But I think the Noah promise means something, that the seasonality, the cycle of nature, if we could call it that, will carry on until the end, until Jesus returns. I think it's reasonable to assume that, but of course God could bring us through many trials to sort of get to that. Yeah,
I think all this we've highlighted in this podcast, isn't it, is that actually this is a complex situation, but we want to keep framing it within that bigger narrative of God who is in control, God and His promises, God and His word, and actually I think my fear is sometimes is that we see the climate, and for some it becomes the big issue. But conscious, just preaching this weekend on that parable of the weeds, where Jesus talks about the end of the harvest and the destruction of those who do not know Him. And when you hear the words of the weight of that's where Jesus talks about people and their destruction eternally. kind of putting that alongside as if somehow creation and the end of it is kind of equal to it. Just doesn't kind of feel the weight of that.
No,
we've kind of missed something when we hear that what the wrath of God and the judgment of God is going to come. And so that's not, again, as we keep saying, not to minimise the impact of talking wisely, of being good stewards, but you end up saying, well, there is an urgent need for churches to preach Christ crucified, and not to be preaching climate change. We want churches proclaiming Christ, and we want, as they preach Christ, to talk about how that then works out as saved believers, loving neighbours, loving others well.
Absolutely. And I think that emotional content where the right apocalyptic fear of final judgment by far outweighs any apocalyptic fear of somehow the planet getting too hot, or floods or tidal waves and everything. That seems more tangible in a way. We've all seen films of related things to do with that. And where we should be putting our kind of emotional capital is in the fear of judgment, apocalyptic judgment, but also the promise that through judgment God will save us to the new heavens and the new earth. And I hope
we look forward to it.
Yeah,
we look forward to a perfect creation where we can enjoy all the delights of creation that I haven't been able to enjoy on this earth because of time, but having a whole eternity to delight in them instead. Hi, thanks for listening to this episode of Ordinary. If you've enjoyed it, and we hope you have, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube right now. Thanks for listening.